Alright lads, welcome back to the channel. Just to start with, I'd just like to say that this video wouldn't be possible without my YouTube members, so a big thank you to everyone currently on the screen. Other than that though boys, welcome to the second video in my beginner's guide to the US tech tree. In the last video, we covered ranks 1 through 5, and in this one we're going to be covering ranks 6 through 8, so if you're interested in only the more modern vehicles, then this video is for you. But without wasting any more time, let's get straight on with our first vehicles. After suffering what felt like a lifetime going through ranks 4 and 5, rank 6 is actually surprisingly pleasant. Instead of the bloated medium tanks we found down in ranks 5 and 6, we're mainly going to be using fairly fast, but more importantly, very flexible vehicles, allowing you to play in a manner of different playstyles, which can alter depending on the map, solving one of the issues I had with the majority of the medium tanks from the previous video, as those vehicles were very map specific and kind of forced you into a static hold down playstyle. In rank 6 we have two main battle rating lineups, those are 8.3 and 9.3, with the latter being by far the more dominant of the two, as 9.3 is very popular right now in the current meta. This is because all of the 10.3 premiums were recently moved up to 10.7, meaning that most 9.3 tanks are now not even really getting up tiers anymore. This also causes a big issue through the 8.3 vehicles, as they are now seeing far more up tiers to 9.3, where they obviously suffer a little bit. But I'm happy to say lads, we're going to start with something good. This is the M551 Sheridan, a tank that saw combat right into the 1990s. In game it sits at battle rating 8.3, meaning it does face some pretty nasty opponents, but thankfully for us we are fast, well armed, and have a great backup lineup. Because the Sheridan was designed to be portable, the survivability is a little bit shit, with most tanks at the battle rating easily being able to kill you in a single hit. Even auto cannons like the 25mm on the Bradley and the French type things will rip you apart without any hassle whatsoever. Basically you don't even have any immunity to anything other than rifle caliber machine gun fire. This is largely due to your armour being made of aluminium, with the thickest part being 30mm in thickness. This does limit your ability to brawl in the Sheridan, but in return it does mean that the power to weight ratio is actually fairly high, at least compared to the other 8.3 vehicles. The Sheridan has a power to weight ratio of 19.7 horsepower per ton, which is decent, but it isn't exceptional for a light tank. While the mobility isn't exceptional compared to other light tanks, the firepower certainly is, as it is more than capable of taking out anything you will see, even in an up tier. This is because it is armed with the 152mm M81 cannon, developed when the Americans considered the future tank warfare to be missile based rather than kinetic. As all tank lovers know though, kinetics did win that fight, down to the sheer cost of the individual missiles, as well as the speed of the saber rounds themselves, obviously being much faster than a missile. But in War Thunder, is this relatively low velocity gun any good? Well, when you first unlock the tank, it's actually pretty shit. Your stock round is the M409A1 heat round, which can penetrate 380mm of armour, which isn't too bad, but it only travels at a peak muzzle velocity of 682 meters per second, far slower than most World War II guns even. This low velocity, as well as the lack of a laser rangefinder, makes aiming this gun very difficult at medium ranges, and especially against enemies that are moving. This issue is made far worse in an up tier, where the average MBT is actually faster than you, despite you being a light tank. The 9.3 MBTs also usually have faster firing, fully stabilised guns, as well as having laser rangefinders and thermal optics. The Sheridan really does shine though when you unlock the Shillelagh missile. This travels actually slower at just under 300 meters per second, and unlike most infantry fighting vehicles or other light tanks, this missile can be fired on the move. This allows you to be far more aggressive in brawl fights with other light vehicles, as they generally have to stop to fire the anti-tank guided missile. But with your armour being so thin, most IFVs are going to be able to shred you with their autocannons, or the low velocity 73mm found on the BMP for example. Just bear in mind that the Sheridan is fully stabilised, so you can basically just run around corners and blast people. It's a very effective little light tank. The only thing that lets the Sheridan down in my opinion is going to be the reload speed, as even with an ace crew, the Sheridan can only reload at a minimum of 12 seconds, which is far above the average of 6.7 seconds at this battle rating, and that's only for the heat round. If you want to reload a missile, the Shillelagh, that is going to take you 20 seconds at a minimum. This isn't too much of an issue if you're a good shot, but if you encounter multiple enemies, you are basically going to die even if you do take out the first guy. So despite the good mobility and fully stabilised gun, which usually would make this tank effective in the brawling role, I typically would tend to stay at medium distances and maybe stay with friendly heavy tanks or medium tanks, and basically playing this more as a supporting vehicle. The Sheridan can also be played as a very good spotting little light tank though, where you do venture off by yourself and go on a little adventure. Just be wary though that this is a very passive style of play. You aren't really going to be able to take on many people due to the aforementioned gun issues, but you are very fast, quite small, quite hard to spot, so you can flank around the sides of a map and spot people, farm some of those spotting points and get into a plane. Overall though, the Sheridan is a lot of fun to play. It's one of the first tanks where we get a stabiliser for the American tech tree. It's also one of the most flexible vehicles that we've covered so far. You can go off on a scouting adventure, you can run round corners and blast people. Just be aware not to get caught in the crosshairs of multiple enemies. A vehicle very similar to the Sheridan, and actually surprisingly very good fun to play, is the M60A2 Starship. This uses basically the same gun and weapon system as found on the Sheridan, however it uses the M60's hull and chassis, with a modified slim design turret, making you overall more survivable, but significantly less mobile. This whole package gives you a very interesting playstyle, as you will bounce the occasional incoming round, and you are practically immune to every enemy autocannon. This allows you to bully enemy light tanks at close range, allowing the M60A2 to thrive where the Sheridan failed, mainly in being aggressive and brawling with enemies. Like the Sheridan, the Starship sits at battle rating 8.3, allowing you to spawn either vehicle depending on the map. If you have a wide open map with lots of cover and rolling hills, I'd recommend spawning the Sheridan. If it's an urban map with short sightlines and 90-degree corners, I'd spawn the Starship. Unlike the Sheridan though, the Starship gets a major upgrade, a laser range finder. This transforms the two chemical rounds from the Sheridan into surprisingly effective options for the Starship. The low velocity of the heat round is kind of solved with the rangefinder, as you no longer have to guess the range in your head. And at close range, the high explosive M657A2 round is more than enough to overpressure many enemy light tanks. And unless they get the chance to fire an ATGM at you, the smaller autocannons are largely ineffective against your armour. The protection of the Starship is good against light vehicles, but against many of the main battle tanks found at and above your battle rating, the armour is largely useless against a competent player. It doesn't really feel fair though for me to shit on the armour of the M60, as when you get in those situations where you run into a Beg Light Panzer or BMP2, you can basically just rush them, and unless they hit your barrel, there isn't much they can do to stop you, at least if they're moving. I actually had a really fun time playing the Starship to get this footage. It's a very quirky vehicle, it isn't really well suited to most maps, but when you get those good close quarters maps with a decent team to back you up, the Starship absolutely can blunt an enemy attack. The last of the 3 missile chads we're going to be covering in rank 6 is the M3 Bradley. Like the 2 previous vehicles, it sits at battle rating 8.3 and plays kind of like a blend of both the Sheridan and the Starship. In terms of survivability, it was designed in response to the BMP2 and its very spicy 30mm cannon, meaning frontally you actually have a substantial level of protection from autocannon guns, allowing you to somewhat brawl with enemy IFVs. But it was also designed to be as mobile as the M1 Abrams, which is why it is rocking around the battle rating with a power to weight ratio of 22.7 horsepower per ton, making it actually more mobile compared to the Sheridan. As I said, the Bradley, or as it is known in War Thunder, the Chadley, is a god amongst the 8.3 lineup. But as with all good things in War Thunder, there is a catch. Whereas most infantry fighting vehicles are essentially missile carriers with a gun bolted on for the sake of it, the Bradley is kind of dependent on its 25mm cannon, as Gaijin recently introduced a realistic change to the TOW missile guidance, making them absolutely ass compared to the contemporary Soviet ATGMs. The TOW missile can penetrate 430mm of armour, compared to the 500mm of the missile fired by the BMP2. The TOW is still useful though, especially at medium to long range. The reason I say this is mainly because at very close ranges the TOW just has a mind of its own. It kind of goes wherever it wants and only really stabilises after around 200 meters. So unlike the Soviet missiles found around this battle rating, which are basically just point blank shotguns, the TOW missiles fired on the Chadley are mainly for medium and long ranges. I wouldn't really depend on them at close range, but unlike a lot of the Soviet vehicles, you do have 2 TOW missiles ready to launch instead of just 1. Luckily for us though, the 25mm gun on the Bradley is an absolute bruiser. With the M791 belts you get 81mm of penetration, allowing you to bully any light vehicle you encounter, and at close ranges the sides of Soviet mediums are vulnerable as well. Despite the small caliber, the 25mm gun on the Bradley is one of the best IFE guns at battle rating 8.3. Due to the Bradley's good mobility, flexibility in the weapons department, as well as the first generation thermals and a gun stabilizer, the M3 Bradley is very effective on the battlefield, and is still usable even in a full up tier. The same cannot be said though about our next vehicle, the T95E1. Whereas the Sheridan and the Bradley had good mobility and firepower, and the Starship had a unique style and the ability to brawl, the T95 doesn't really have anything going for it, and it is by far the weakest tank in the American 8.3 lineup. The T95E1 has no stabilizer and no thermals, and no real mobility to speak of either, leaving it feeling like a downgrade compared to the 3 other missile vehicles we've just covered. What the T95 has in theory though is armour. The upper frontal plate is 95mm thick, but is highly angled at 71 degrees, giving it well over 270mm of effective thickness. The turret of the T95E1 is also highly angled, and was actually the basis of the upgraded M60A1 turret, which we will cover shortly in this video. The highly angled turret means that close ranged rush shots are likely to bounce, and even allows you to play the tank hull down. But at point blank range, the relatively weak armour around the gun barrel is very easy to go through, with only the 180mm of armour plate in this area, a walk in the park for most guns at this battle rating, not to mention the guns and ammunition seen in a 9.3 match. For me though, the mobility is the real deal breaker. We have taken a huge plunge in terms of mobility, dropping down to 14.5 horsepower per tonne, giving it the same mobility as the M60A2 Starship, but with absolutely none of the flair. One of the only redeeming factors of the T95 is the high pressure 90mm cannon, boasting a very high muzzle velocity of 1570 meters per second, giving the T320 Sable round 293mm of penetration against flat armour. And against armour angled at 60 degrees, it can still penetrate 166mm of armour plate, which to be fair to the tank is very powerful. But we also lose the stabilizer, which really limits the vehicle. The 3 previous vehicles, the Sheridan, M60A2 and the Bradley, are all very competent when it comes to brawling, but with the T95 you are once again forced into a more passive, medium range, static playstyle, which certainly will net you a bunch of kills, especially if you have the right map, but it's the most boring way to play War Thunder imaginable, and I find myself never really wanting to spawn this tank, instead preferring the Bradley, or maybe even the M60A1. This slightly upgraded pattern tank sits at battle rating 8.3 and is actually surprisingly good. It gets a better APDS round with greatly improved angled penetration, allowing you to penetrate basically anything you come across from the front. And with the AOS upgrade, standing for Add-on Stabilizer, you finally have a decent brawling vehicle. The A1 designation is due to the new needle nose turret, giving you substantially better protection compared to the old frying pan turret found on the rank 5 M60. Unfortunately though, the good old turret ring weak spot is still there, meaning literally anything can penetrate you frontally with very little effort if they know where to shoot. The weight has also increased to 48 tonnes on the A1, up from 46.2 tonnes on the M60, reducing the power to weight ratio slightly, down to 15.6 horsepower per tonne. This is by no means terrible, and the M60A1 is surprisingly pleasant to drive. Apart from the new stabilizer, the gun is basically identical to the one found on the original M60, with the exception of the addition of the 2nd generation M728 APDS round. First generation rounds were very hard but very brittle, allowing them to have high penetration against flat armour, but they would simply shatter against angled armour. Second generation rounds, such as the M728, they're made of actually softer material. This means they can't actually penetrate as much as the first generation rounds, but when they hit a highly angled armour surface, instead of simply shattering into 1,000 pieces, they remain largely intact, which gives them better angled penetration, but much worse flat penetration. While this might sound like a downgrade, in reality most tanks you're going to be fighting at this battle rating don't even use flat armour anymore, so it is actually quite a substantial buff to the vehicle. Despite the upgraded SAKO round, the M60 is really starting to show its age at this battle rating, and as we'll see with the remaining M60 variants, they were basically trying to squeeze every bit of life left out of the M60 chassis, but it really had nothing left to give. In War Thunder, the AOS is fine at battle rating 8.3, but in a 9.3 match, I'd recommend just not even spawning it out. It can't even come close to competing with the fairly modern 9.3 main battle tanks, so just spawn out the Bradley instead. After the M60A1, we actually have two more M60 variants, both of which are utter garbage. The first, the Rise P, or Reliability Improvement Select Equipment, was a modernisation of, you guessed it, the M60, making it easier for the crews to do maintenance and generally improve the reliability of the tank's onboard equipment. None of this is modelled in game, so why have Gaijin added it? Well, it does get some useless add-on explosive reactive armour, providing 370mm of protection against chemical warheads. All this for the low battle rating of 8.7, where basically no one is firing Heater Fest and everyone is firing Sabo or APDS, making this tank utterly useless. The mobility has also been nuked, with the weight increasing to 53.2 tons, all while using the same 750 horsepower engine found on the original M60 variant, giving you a power to weight ratio of 14.1 horsepower per ton, which is World War II levels of mobility. So are there any redeeming factors with the increase to battle rating 8.7? Well, you do get the M735 APFSDS round with nearly 300mm of penetration. This first generation fin round basically combines the flat armor penetration of the M392A2 round with the good angled penetration of the later M728 round, giving you a pretty competent piece of ammunition, both against flat and angled armour. You also retain the gun stabiliser found on the M60 AOS, giving you good gun handling. But most other tanks at the similar battle rating also have the same powerful ammunition and a gun stabiliser, so you don't really have any advantages to speak of in the Rise P. Overall, you will probably never even realise the Rise P is in the game. No one ever plays these vehicles as they are absolute garbage. It's one of the vehicles American mains like to pretend didn't exist, and with the battle rating of 8.7, there's absolutely no reason to bring it alongside the M60A2 Sheridan or the Bradley, as it would absolutely nuke that good 8.3 lineup. Luckily for all players of War Thunder, the Rise P is folded with the M60A1 AOS, meaning you can just bypass this piece of shit. The last M60 tank is the M60A3 TTS, a good tank ruined by its battle rating. The TTS sits at battle rating 9.0, putting it halfway between the American 8.3 and 9.3 lineup. There's no point bringing this in a 8.3 lineup, and at 9.0 there's much better vehicles, so again, like the Rise P, barely anyone actually plays this vehicle. But what actually is the M60A3 TTS? Well, we retain the same armour profile and explosive reactive armour as found on the M60 Rise P, but we now have a laser rangefinder, upgraded main gun ammunition, as well as a thermal imager, hence the name TTS or Tank Thermal Sight. This upgrade was carried out in the late 1970s and was the Army's final attempt to keep the US ground forces competitive until the M1 Abrams finally arrived in the early 80s. The armour of the TTS is absolutely useless at battle rating 9.0. Most other vehicles are either using composite armour or instead rely on high mobility for survival. In comparison, the TTS has neither protection or speed, but the power to weight ratio has increased slightly to 14.3 horsepower per ton compared to 14.1 on the Rise P, an almost negligible increase. The real difference though is the firepower and gun handling, mainly due to the addition of the M774 APFSDS round, the same ammunition found on the M1 Abrams at battle rating 10.7. This allows you to go straight through the front of Soviet brutes such as the T-62M and the T-72A, and in combination with the addition of a laser rangefinder, it makes the TTS a very potent long-range sniper. But like so many vehicles that I've covered in the American tech tree so far, it kind of forces you into a long-range static playstyle, which most maps now really just don't, it's not very suitable. Gaijin just has an obsession with close-range urban maps at the minute, and it kind of nukes half the vehicles in War Thunder. Because of this, many people will actually grind the TTS just to get to the other Abrams tree, but they're probably never really play it, as it's really only spawned out in desperation, and even then it's just a really bad tank. Overall, both these two pattern variants are dog shit. The M60A3 TTS should be given M833 and put in at battle rating 9.3. It could even be given, I believe, M900. I'm not sure if the breach on the M60A3 could fire it, but you may as well just give the TTS a better round and put it a higher battle rating. For the M60 AOS, that thing should just be put down to 8.3. There's no reason for it to be 8.7 at all. After the doom and gloom of the M60s though, it's time to look at the workhorses of the 6th rank of the US tech tree. Both of these vehicles were designed alongside Germany, and it resulted in tanks that were massively over-engineered, massively expensive, and satisfied neither the Germans or the Americans. In fact, the failure of the MBT-70 program is what led to the M60 remaining in service for so long, only being replaced in frontline units in the early 80s, but the main failures of the MBT-70 programs were mainly logistical and financial, again neither of which are modelled in-game. So are the two MBT-70 models any good? Well, the first vehicle, the XM803, was the downgraded version of the MBT-70, aimed at reducing the cost, and therefore they removed quite a few features, mainly the loss of the 20mm cannon on the roof, as well as a much weaker engine. This vehicle sits at battle rating 9.0, but its bigger, better brother, the MBT-70, which is folded with the XM803, sits at battle rating 9.3. For a vehicle that weighs 51.7 tons, the mobility is actually very good, even dwarfing the famed Leopard 1. This is due to the engine producing 1,250 horsepower, giving the vehicle a power-to-weight ratio of 24.2 horsepower per ton. This gives you massive flexibility on the battlefield, especially against the Soviet teams, who are still largely using early T-64 and T-72 models, which have the mobility of a blind babushka that's 7 bottles deep of vodka. The price you pay for the high speed, however, is the distinct lack of protection. Neither the XM803 or the MBT-70 have any sort of composite armour schemes, instead relying on the very dated spaced armour concept. This will protect you from nothing more than 30mm autocannons, with virtually every other weapon being able to go straight through your turret. And that is a major issue for these vehicles. This is because all 3 crew members are located in the turret. This allowed the driver's position in the hull to be eliminated, which allowed the entire vehicle to be much lower compared to a regular main battle tank. This works very well in concept, but in real life it causes havoc with the driver's senses, with many drivers getting motion sickness and basically being completely disorientated. It also meant that 2 of the 3 crew members were located on the left hand side of the vehicle in the turret. This means that any penetrating round to the left hand side of the turret is almost certainly going to result in a one-hit kill. This lack of armour isn't the end of the world though, and can largely be negated by clever map position, as well as not really putting yourself in harm's way. So we've got good mobility and kinda poor armour. What about the firepower? Well, again, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Both the XM803 and the MBT-70 use the same 152mm XM150E5 cannon. Both tanks also use an autoloader system, with a constant reload rate of 7.5 seconds. This is a little slower compared to most contemporary Soviet guns, and substantially slower compared to the average NATO reload speed of 6.7 seconds. But the real problem with both of these tanks is the ammunition. When stock, you come equipped with a heat round capable of penetrating 380mm of armour, which isn't bad, but the round travels at only 754 meters per second. This is much lower than most rounds being fired back at you. This really limits your accuracy at longer ranges. You do thankfully have a laser rangefinder on both of these vehicles, but this is quite a high tier modification, and when stock these are very painful to play. The other unlockable round is the MGM-51C, a variant of the shillelagh that we looked at on the Sheridan. This again travels very slowly at 286 meters per second, but can penetrate 431mm of armour. Unlike a lot of early ATGMs, this missile can be fired on the move, and many people use this as their main round. The biggest issue with the round though is that the reload is significantly longer compared to the other types of ammunition. The MGM-51 has a constant reload of 13 seconds, which doesn't really justify its use in my opinion, at least when you've unlocked the Sabo round. Whereas the missile is slow, the Sabo is actually incredibly fast, moving at 1,509 meters per second, making it very easy to aim at close range. Unfortunately though, the penetration isn't the best, at only 285mm of pen. This means you can't reliably go through the upper frontal plates on some of the big, scurry tanks you're going to be facing, mainly the T-72s and T-64s. Again though, this can be worked around by proper aiming and good positioning, and to be honest, for most opponents you come across, this SAKO round is going to be more than good enough for most common 9.3 opponents. In my opinion, the unlocking of the SAKO round in the second rank of the modifications is essential for making both of these vehicles competitive. Relying on either the heat or the ATGM is very painful, and I remember the stock grind for these vehicles being particularly harsh. The MBT-70 does have one other advantage though, other than the godlike mobility, and that is the 20mm cannon mounted in the turret on the roof. This can be used for a range of devilish tricks, or from shooting down incoming helicopters to ripping up the barrel of an enemy MBT. This gives the MBT-70 a sort of trump card in a lot of close range engagements, as it can simply bamboozle the enemy with 20mm cannon fire. This is a high risk, high reward style of gameplay due to the very lacking armour of this vehicle. But if you are a true mad lad, it is a very fun and rewarding way to play this vehicle. Overall though, the XM803 is rather forgettable, especially once you unlock the MBT-70. Despite the latter vehicle being folded, I'd still highly recommend people grind for it, as it is one of the best vehicles in the 9.3 lineup. That being said, at battle rating 9.3 you don't really have the most substantial vehicles to back you up in that lineup, mainly relying on several premiums such as the XM1. The only squadron vehicle we're going to be looking at in rank 6 is the M901. This is a very old vehicle at this point, but it is still just as powerful today as it was when it was introduced. The M901 sits at battle rating 8.3, giving it a fantastic lineup alongside the Bradley M60A2 as well as the M551. It uses the M113 chassis, giving it decent mobility, but its main benefit is teased in the name, the M901, also known as the improved tow vehicle. It comes equipped with a sort of hammerhead turret, capable of carrying 2 ITO missiles, and a first-gen thermal imager. This turret will fold backwards when moving at speeds over 20 km/h, which does mean you can't really be aggressive with this vehicle. You kind of have to stop and then let enemies come to you, but it is absolutely goated in a defensive position, especially on maps with large rolling hills, such as Maginot Line or Fulda. This is due to the turret sitting high above the hull, giving it 30 degrees of gun depression, allowing you to completely hide the hull in most defensive positions. This turns you into a borderline overpowered missile slinger on certain maps, but as you can imagine, on the more urban maps where there's no verticality, this thing's basically useless. The missile, compared to the Bradley, has also been improved, now firing the ITO. This upgrade gives you 200mm of additional penetration compared to the original, being able to go through 630mm of armour now. This is more than enough to kill any vehicle at battle rating 8.3, as well as in a full up tier to 9.3, just with the exception of a few French vehicles which come equipped with ERA blocks. While there are quite a lot of squadron vehicles added to War Thunder over the years, the M901 remains one of the best support vehicles for the US tech tree, despite its limited ability to be aggressive. Overall though, I did find the M901 to be very fun to play. Obviously it does have its limitations, but if you're on a map, again like Fulda or Maginot Line, where you can basically just sit over a hill, you can literally just fire missiles without the enemy being able to fire back at you. We then come on to the last 2 vehicles in rank 6, one of them being an absolute unit that terrorises the skies around it, and the other is about as useful as a Marmite flavoured condom. We'll start with the good one, the M247 Sergeant York. This was mired in controversy, as its opposing trial partner, the XM246, basically an American Gepard, beat it in every single test the US Army tested it on. But for some strange reason, which definitely wasn't corruption in the US government, the weaker M247 was awarded the contract. But as we all know boys, private American companies donating billions of dollars to politicians isn't corruption, that's lobbying. Despite the Sergeant York's real life shortcomings, in game it is an absolute monster. The combination of rapid firing 40mm Bofors guns, with literally the F-16's fire control radar, as well as proximity fused high explosive rounds, makes the M247 the master of close range air defense. Let's start with some basics though. The M247 is housed on the M48 chassis, giving it pretty poor power to weight ratio, with only 13.8 horsepower per ton. This isn't particularly bad, especially for a vehicle that realistically is just going to be sat at spawn, but in certain situations such as the late stages of a game, where you are down to just in SBAA, the M247 isn't really suited for roaming, meaning it doesn't have the same flexibility as the German Gepard or the Soviet Tunguska. The Sergeant York comes armed with two 40mm L70 guns, a modernisation of the famous Bofors found on the M42 and the M19 down in rank 3. These however have longer barrels, giving them much better muzzle velocity, as well as radar guidance, theoretically making it easier to hit oncoming vehicles. According to Gaijin, both the track and search radar use NATO I-band, more commonly known as X-band radar. Not really sure if that's true or not, as most search radars use S-band, but what do I know? On the front of the M247 is the APG 66, the same radar used in the early F-16 models. To be honest though, I found the radar very hit and miss on this vehicle, seemingly not being able to acquire lock at certain targets, especially at closer range. But once you do get a lock, it becomes a very effective short range weapon. Your main ammunition is the M822 proxy fused high explosive round. They move at 1100 meters per second and excel at shooting down the typically slower moving cast planes around this battle rating. You do also have an armor piercing belt, but it is limited by the fact it can only penetrate 38mm of armor at point blank range. So again, unlike the Gepard, it doesn't really have a nasty surprise for the vulnerable sides of Soviet MBTs. The M247 also has a very big weak spot, and that is the lack of range. This is actually the reason that the M247 was cancelled in real life, as the Soviet army was pivoting to attack helicopters with long-range anti-tank missiles. This put the helicopters outside the effective range of the 40mm Bofors, and this is by far the biggest weakness of the Sergeant York in War Thunder. While you can get a radar lock on a helicopter at around 4 km, by the time your rounds reach those distances, they have lost so much velocity that dodging them becomes very easy through the skilled helicopter pilot. This means that most helicopters are basically immune until around 2 km range, by which time his ATGM is almost certainly seconds from killing you. It's the same for enemy fast jets as well. Unless they're on a gun run, they are pretty hard to hit if they are actively manoeuvring. Because of this, I'd recommend holding fire until they are on the short and final, basically setting up an attack and flying straight towards the target. This makes them easier to hit, as they usually aren't looking at tracer fire and focusing on the person they intend to bomb. Just be aware this does run the risk of getting a teammate or yourself killed if you somehow manage to miss. All that being said, the Sergeant York is a fantastic vehicle, despite it being bumped up in battle rating from 8.3 to 9.0 in the last year or so, which means it does come up against some opponents that it will struggle with. Regardless though, it is a million times more effective than our next vehicle. This thing is the improved Chaparral, and it absolutely sucks, so God knows how bad the regular Chaparral would be. This vehicle was developed alongside the M163 Vulcan we covered in the previous video. The Army's Mauler program, a radar-guided anti-air vehicle, was deemed a failure due to the radar being insufficient, both in terms of accuracy as well as the time needed to acquire a lock. This led to the development of both the M163 and the Chaparral, both of which lacked any sort of fire control system, simply relying on the gunner's own aiming. The original Chaparral used the AIM-9D, which was a rear aspect only missile, meaning it was only effective against Soviet fighters after they dropped a few Fab 500s on your convoy, which was less than ideal. The improved variant, which we have in game, received 2 new missile variants, as well as a track radar. The 2 missiles are big improvements over the original, as they both feature all aspect lock-on capabilities, meaning your troops may not be sprayed with supersonic shrapnel after all. The MIM-72C is available as stock on the Chaparral, with the MIM-72E being unlocked in the first rank of the modifications, with the only difference between the two is that the 72E has a smokeless motor, which would make it pretty impossible for enemy players to detect. Now the reason I emphasise would be is because Gaijin forgot to model this in the game, so in War Thunder there is literally no difference between the 72C and the 72E, and you may as well just use the C model as it is literally free to fire. The reason for my hostility to this weapon is that it is even less effective against helicopters than the Sergeant York. As it uses an early infrared seeker, the slow moving helicopters don't produce enough skin heat in order for the missile to get a lock. This allows enemy helicopters to get right close in before you can actually shoot them, And it really is the same for jets as well. The all aspect lock range is only like 3.5 kilometers against jets. So once again, the Sergeant York just has a better attack envelope. That being said, at very close range, the Chaparral is still very deadly to anything flying, particularly in the rear aspect. To me, it's just let down by its shocking performance against helicopters, which I spammed out like crazy around this battle rating at 9.0, but due to the American 9.3 lineup being quite sparse, you can always just take both the Chaparral and the Sergeant York and really make sure the skies are American sovereign territory. And that's a wrap for rank 6. The 8.3 lineup is very fun to play, featuring lots of quirky vehicles, each with unique playstyles, which give you a really satisfying feeling once you master these vehicles. The downside though being the fairly brutal up tiers to 9.3 after the recent changes. The saving grace though of rank 6 is the emerging American 9.3 lineup. If you are free to play, then the MBT-70 is going to be your go-to vehicle. If you're a premium hoarder collector like me, then the XM1 is also pretty nice. And the XM1 is actually getting a second chance at life in many ways, as it no longer gets the brutal up tiers it did when the 10.3 premiums were roaming around. If you're limited by crew slots though, at battle rating 8.3 I'd take the M3 Bradley, M901, Sheridan, M8-800T, and then either the M60A2 or the M60A1 AOS. I'd then probably pick something like the F9F8 for CAS, but props are still effective at this battle rating, as long as you stay on the deck. At battle rating 9.3, you don't really have too many vehicles to choose from, so I'd go with both the XM803 and the MBT-70. I'd probably take the M60A3 TTS for backup, and then the two SPAAs, the Sergeant York and the Chaparral, as well as the A4E early for CAS. If you do have some premiums like the XM1, then I'd also bring this along as well. We now come on to rank 7, one of the largest in the US tech tree, and it's here where America both peaks and then takes another nosedive to the Marianas. The 10.3 American lineup is fantastic, with a range of flexible vehicles, powerful both in an up tier as well as in a down tier. But the top tier American lineup at battle rating 11.7 and then later 12.0 is pretty much one of the worst top tier lineups in the entire game, featuring incredibly bloated Abrams tanks, weighed down by urban warfare kits which serve no purpose in peer-on-peer tank combat, a top-tier anti-air system that is basically useless against maneuvering opponents, as well as a light tank with a 75mm cannon that may as well be firing 22 long rifle rounds. The only redemption of top-tier America is the fantastic close air support jets, in the form of the F-16 Charlie and the F-15 Eagle. But instead of moulding about what's to come, let's take a look at the fantastic early rank 7 vehicles. Like in rank 6, rank 7 also has a fantastic Bradley, but this is the M3A3, a dedicated fighting vehicle of the US Cavalry. In War Thunder, it sits at battle rating 10.0 and features some noticeable improvements compared to the previous M3, mainly being the addition of a laser rangefinder, a new sub-caliber AP FSDS round, improved thermal optics, as well as two new variants of the TOW-2 missile. Like the original M3 Bradley, the M3A3 is armoured in a way to give you somewhat useful armour when fighting contemporary Soviet IFVs, allowing you to somewhat brawl with enemy BMP-2s, BMP-3s, and any other 30mm based fighting vehicle. Just watch out for the potent anti-tank guided missiles, with the BMD-4 and BMD-4M being your most feared opponents. Unfortunately, the new upgrades have added a few winter pounds to the chassis, significantly reducing the mobility compared to the M3 Bradley, with the M3A3 having a power-to-weight ratio of 20.1 horsepower per tonne, with the original M3 being 22.7. Regardless, a power-to-weight ratio of 20 is still very good, but you no longer have a real advantage in terms of mobility. This is due to the rapid increase of power-to-weight ratio of the contemporary main battle tanks, meaning that you don't really have an advantage over them anymore. You may get to an objective a few seconds before a main battle tank, but it doesn't allow you to set up an early game ambush position. Because of this rather limited mobility, and the firepower upgrades that we're about to cover, I'd strongly recommend playing this tank more as a long-range tank destroyer, rather than an up-close support vehicle. While the mobility and the armour of the M3A3 aren't really noticeable compared to the M3, the firepower and gun handling is vastly improved. The main new addition is the M919 AP FSDS round, with just over 100mm of penetration at point blank range. They travel at 1,385 meters per second, but they do only weigh 100 grams. This means they lose a lot of their penetrative power over distance, and to be honest, they are also incredibly inaccurate at longer ranges. So unlike the German Puma or Swedish CV9040s, the M3A3 isn't really an effective sniping vehicle, at least not with its 25mm cannon. The situation is completely different with the missiles though. Like the original TOW, these missiles suck at close range engagements due to guidance complications, but at medium and long range they are incredibly deadly and pack a huge punch. When stock, you have access to the TOW 2. This travels at 329 meters per second and can penetrate 800mm of armor. In rank 1 of the modifications, we can unlock the TOW 2A. This is virtually identical to the original missile, except it has an additional smaller warhead, turning the TOW into a tandem warhead missile, giving it much better performance against Soviet and Chinese vehicles, as they usually do come equipped with ERA. The final form of the TOW missile is the TOW 2B. This swaps out the forward-facing warhead for a much smaller top-down attack system, allowing you to target the weaker roofs of enemy vehicles. The TOW 2B travels at the same speed as the 2 previous missiles, except it has much less penetration, only 100mm. This is more than enough to overpressure enemy light tanks in a top-down attack role, with the previously mentioned BMD-4s being particularly vulnerable to this type of attack, but against many main battle tanks, it usually only destroys the gun breech or other internal components. This is due to the smaller warhead not creating enough of a shockwave to overpressure the crew members inside. In terms of which missile to actually use, I found that the TOW 2A to be far more reliable, but of course you have to be able to see the enemy to use this weapon. When using the TOW 2B, even enemy behind cover is vulnerable, as the TOW 2B uses a magnetic detonator, so you can simply fire the missile over their head, hopefully destroy their ability to fight back, and then finish them off by other methods. Overall, I don't think the M3A3 is as powerful as the M3 Bradley was down at battle rating 8.3. At their battle ratings, the M3 Bradley is a very feared opponent, whereas the M3A3 is only really able to be effective in medium to long range engagements. That being said, the M3A3 Bradley is a fantastic vehicle, it's well worth grinding out, but I didn't really find myself playing it that much after battle rating 10.0. A vehicle that I find myself spawning pretty much every game though is the Lavad. This is an incredibly competent all-round vehicle, being able to act as an anti-air system, a light tank, as well as a tank destroyer. It is a wheeled close-range anti-air system based off the 8x8 LAV chassis. This is the first anti-air vehicle the Americans get which isn't just designed to sit at spawn waiting for enemies to spawn in. It is fast, well armed and very flexible, but unfortunately its name, the light armoured vehicle, is very literal, with 50 caliber rounds being able to penetrate the armour of this tank. Simple solution though, just don't let yourself get shot at, it's that easy. And with the fantastic mobility of the Lavad, that is a very reasonable tactic. You can reach a top speed of over 100 km per hour, and you can reach that speed very quickly on hard terrain. This in turn allows you to be very aggressive at the start of a match, but the wives of your crew members may not take too favourably to that idea, as your chances of survival with an encounter with a main battle tank is next to zero. So what makes the Lavad so great? Well, apart from its mobility, it's also incredibly well armed. Your main weapon is the 25mm GAU-12 Equalizer. This is a 5-barreled rotary cannon with a very high rate of fire. Combined with the PGU-20U HVAC belt, you can penetrate over 60mm of armor at point blank range, so you can find the side of an enemy main battle tank, you really can punish them, if you're into that sort of thing. While the GAU-12 is really good at annoying enemy vehicles, it's even better at shooting down incoming planes, at least at close range. The high rate of fire combined with the infrared track and lead indicator makes the Lavad very effective at defending American airspace. But your cannon isn't the only solution for the fixed and rotary wing menaces. We also carry the Stinger missile, with both the E and K variants. The main difference being the K has a proximity fuse warhead, meaning it doesn't have to physically hit an enemy in order to detonate the missile. Unfortunately, like the Chaparral from rank 6, the Stinger missiles are relatively short-range weapons, meaning they are pretty useless against helicopters hovering at long range. Despite this weakness, if an enemy fast jet gets within around 4 km, they basically have no escape other than diving for the deck and popping flares. You can carry a maximum of 16 Stingers into a battle, but if you take the Lavad's secret weapon, this number is reduced to just 12 missiles. But in my opinion, 12 anti-aircraft missiles is more than enough for the average battle. The secret of the Lavad is the Hydra rocket pod. This sits on top of the turret in place of one of the missile launchers. The Hydra rockets are capable of penetrating 290mm of armour, making them very effective for spamming at enemy tanks. Again, like the GAU-12, the Hydras are best applied to the thinner sides of enemy MBTs. This presents a larger, weaker target and vaguely helps the main weaknesses of the Hydra, the god-awful accuracy. Overall, despite some serious shortcomings as an air defense vehicle, mainly the lack of a radar or IRST, as well as the limited engagement range, the Lavad is a seriously effective and fun vehicle to play, and is one of the highlights of the 10.3 American lineup. Where the Lavad fails though, the XM975 excels. Based off the M109 chassis, as well as using the French Roland missile system, the 975 is a very effective long-range anti-air system, being able to reach out and knock down those bastard Ka-50s with its 8km range missiles, practically double the engagement ranges of the Lavad Stingers. While the XM975 is undoubtedly the better dedicated anti-air weapon, it has none of the flexibility of the Lavad. It's slow, unprotected, and has no real ability to target enemy MBTs. When stock, the XM975 comes with the Roland 1 missile, with a range of 6.3km, which is good enough for targeting enemy cast jets, but helicopters and attack drones are pretty much out of the question. In rank 2, we unlock the Roland 3, which has a range of 8km, as well as getting a very large blast frag warhead. The missile's nearly 7 kilos of TNT filler give it 54mm of penetration, allowing the 975 to defend itself against enemy infantry fighting vehicles pretty effectively, but 54mm of pen isn't really going to do much against most main battle tanks. Overall, the 975 is a great dedicated anti-air vehicle, which sits at a similar battle rating to the Lavad. Because of this, if you are a free-to-play player and you don't really have a lot of lineup slots to take out, I'd recommend taking the Lavad instead of the XM975, but I'm lucky and I have all the American crew slots available, so I take both the XM and the Lavad into battle, where they both serve me very well. Another fantastic 10.3 vehicle is the M1128 Striker, a vehicle that had a range of issues in real life, as well as in War Thunder. Unlike real life, where the US Army simply retired the vehicle, in War Thunder, Gaijin has given this vehicle some heavy buffs in the last couple of years, turning it into a very effective tank destroyer. Like the Lavad, the Striker is an 8x8 chassis, but this time it was designed entirely for the US Army rather than the Marine Corps, so it incorporated much more electronic and sensor technology, and could carry a 9-man squad of soldiers, making the Striker Dragoon a very flexible troop taxi. But the M1128 was a variant designed for retaining fire supremacy in low intensity combat zones, where the logistics of flying in an Abrams was just too much hassle. This meant that the M1128 had to be light, restricting the armour, main cannon, and ammunition carried. None of this really matters in War Thunder, as the M1128 is the 10.3 American lineup's main ambush predator, coming with 3rd gen thermals, incredibly modern M900 AP FSDS rounds, as well as an autoloader system. One of the downsides though is the mobility. It certainly is no Lavad, you just don't have the same level of eye-watering speed. It's still decent though, able to easily get up to around 60km per hour, but I feel like the acceleration is a bit worse on the Striker. The survivability is also pretty poor, being a large unmaneuverable target with only a core 12mm of steel armour, and an additional 25mm of Mexus 2 applique on top. This protects you from 50 caliber rounds, but nothing much else. But the M1128 isn't famed for its mobility or armour protection. It's the 105mm cannon that this tank is feared. The M68A1E8 is mounted in a recessed turret, giving it a rather strange look. This design allowed the crew members to be seated quite low in the hull, allowing players to sit hull down with only the gun visible, theoretically reducing incoming damage to just destroyed modules. But in War Thunder's god-awful maps, the places where this would work are incredibly few and far between, and isn't really a viable strategy for most maps. Another issue that would limit this playstyle is the very poor gun handling of the cannon. Seeing as the Striker is already very tall, the 5 degrees of gun depression really just isn't enough in order to work any sort of ridgeline, meaning you are going to have to expose your very weak hull far more than you'd like. This can be slightly remedied, as the M1128 has a pneumatic suspension, allowing you to lower the front of the vehicle, giving you around 10 degrees of effective gun depression. But this is very fiddly, takes time, and still isn't really enough due to the long hull and rear-mounted gun. Where the Striker really shines, however, is the ammunition. The M900 is basically capable of going through anything you find at your own battle rating, as well as in a full up tier. Travelling at just over 1,500 meters per second, the M900 round is capable of penetrating 522mm of armour at point blank range, and over 300mm of armour angled at 60 degrees, basically giving you the power to lol-pen anything you encounter. This ability, combined with 3rd generation thermal imagers, makes it an incredibly lethal sniper on the wider rural maps. But again, with many of the vehicles I've covered throughout this series, it is incredibly restricted on the tight urban maps that are frequently becoming very common in War Thunder. The bad brawling situation is also made worse by the fairly slow reload of 7.5 seconds. Overall, I still enjoy the M1128, despite its rather rigid playstyle. The ability of M900 to penetrate anything you look at allows it to remain a prominent threat to any MBT you come across. While I wouldn't advise taking on an MBT on equal terms, you can use the decent speed and fantastic optics to position yourself in places where you are guaranteed to get off the first shot. And usually with M900, one shot is all you need. A tank that was widely mocked when it was first introduced to the game, but is actually very powerful, is the 120S. This is an M60 hull with an M1A1 turret mounted on top. This gives you a very powerful 120mm cannon, very powerful modern sabre rounds, which makes M900 look like a joke, 2nd gen thermals, as well as a blistering 5-second reload, making you an insane hull down monster. The elephant in the room is obviously the M60 hull, which is a leftover from the early 60s, and far past its prime at this battle rating of 10.3. It has no composite armour schemes on the hull, still relying on welded steel armour plate. This is undoubtedly the massive weak spot of this vehicle, as enemies can completely bypass your well-protected turret. However, you can also bypass this problem by proper positioning on maps and staying hull down when possible. The mobility of the M60 hull is also rather poor, still retaining the same 750 horsepower engine that we covered on the original M60 as well as the M60A3 TTS, but now it's carrying the additional weight of the new armour and electronics. This means the weight of the vehicle has increased to 56.3 tonnes, dropping that power to weight ratio down to 13.3 horsepower per tonne. This is pretty god-awful for a 10.3 vehicle, and you are going to be facing tanks such as the Leopard 2A4, KPZ-70 and the T-80B, all of which will run rings around you. But War Thunder isn't a sprint, it isn't even an endurance race, and the weaknesses of mobility can be worked around. Thankfully, the firepower of the 120S is second to none at this battle rating, allowing you to stay at long to medium ranges and become an incredibly deadly sniper. Even on the more urban city maps, as long as you stay vaguely close to friendly MBTs, you are still a monster in close range engagements due to the incredibly good turret traverse, owing to the modern M1A1 turret. This modern turret also gives you a huge advantage in terms of optics, reload and ammunition, compared to pretty much every MBT at your own battle rating. To start, the M1A1 turret on the 120S got upgraded thermal images from the more modern Abrams, giving you 2nd gen thermals at 10.3. You also have a 5-second reload with an ace crew, which is around 1.7 seconds faster than most other MBTs at this battle rating, and 2.5 seconds than most Soviet tanks. We then come on to the ammunition. When stock, we do only have a Heat of S round, which is a little rough, but in rank 1 of the modifications, we unlock the M829 SAKO with over 470mm of penetration. This alone is more than good enough for any MBT around battle rating 10.3, and has similar penetration levels of the Soviet 3BM42 Mango. But in the 4th rank lads, we unlock the M829A1 with just short of 600mm of penetration, which simply lol-pens everything you fire it at. Overall, the 120S does have some very serious flaws, the poor mobility, large size, and basically useless armour scheme. But I really do enjoy playing the 120S, it's a very charming vehicle. Just stay back a bit, don't try to brawl, pick a nice Overwatch position, let enemies come to you, and put those fantastic 2nd gen thermals and M829A1 rounds to work. Well boys, that's it for the fantastic 10.0 and 10.3 vehicles. From here on out, things start to get a lot worse. Starting with the M1 Abrams. This is basically the same gun and ammunition, as well as the fire control system to be honest, of the M60A3 TTS that we covered in rank 6, except it is now housed in a smaller, faster, and more heavily protected hull and turret. Unfortunately, the new hull and turret armour is mainly focused on chemical protection rather than kinetic, meaning against most contemporary main battle tanks at battle rating 10.7, the armour is quite underwhelming. And that really is the best way to describe both the early and the later models of the M1 Abrams, underwhelming. One of the good things about the M1 though is the vastly improved mobility compared to pretty much every other American main battle tank so far. The Abrams can reach a top speed of 80 km per hour and weighs 55.7 tonnes, giving it a power to weight ratio of 27.3 horsepower per tonne, giving you the same levels of mobility as the famed T-80U. It's just a shame that we don't have the same armour scheme as the T-80U. Generally speaking though, against chemical and early Sable rounds, the M1's armour is actually fairly good, with very strong turret cheeks. The issue comes when encountering the major players around 10.7 to 11.3. Most Soviet tanks with a 125mm cannon can go straight through the majority of your armour scheme, as can most of the newer premiums in War Thunder that you'll see on a regular basis. This isn't even mentioning the gaping holes in your armour scheme, mainly the turret ring, which literally every vehicle can penetrate with ease. It's also the same for the gun breach, which is absolutely huge, allowing enemies to easily knock out both of your breach and your turret ring in a single hit, not to mention the lives of your crew members. This is a reoccurring issue in the Abrams series of vehicles. Seemingly every incoming round knocks out your gun, meaning you spend most of the time in game repairing rather than fighting. This weakness to incoming fire leaves you unable to brawl really, instead relying on lightning attacks, pushing out, shooting, and then quickly getting back into cover, that sort of stuff. The problem though is that you don't really have the firepower to snap your shots. They need to be well aimed in order to reliably go through an enemy's armour. For a start, the M1 Abrams is still rocking the M68 105mm cannon, first found on the M60 back at battle rating 8.0. Thankfully we do have a range of improvements such as a thermal imager, but this is only a first gen IR imager, meaning it is pretty underwhelming when we have vehicles such as the 120S, M3A3 and the M1128, all with high res second gen thermals and at a lower battle rating. It doesn't get much better when it comes to the ammunition either. When stock, the Abrams comes with a heat of fest round, which is just pure suffering, especially as the M1 Abrams is battle rating 10.7, meaning it's frequently seeing up tiers to the absolute shit show that is the 11.7 premium spam, where this heat of fest round is basically less than useless. In rank 1 you get the M735, which is utter dog shit, and I'm not even wasting my breath talking about it. But in rank 4 you do get a slight upgrade. This is the very anemic M774 round, with 327mm of penetration. This is by far the weakest 105mm saber round found in the entire game. It's funny how Gaijin chooses to balance these vehicles, because in real life the M774 was used only for a couple of months, before it was phased out for the much stronger M833 round. The majority of American vehicles with 105mm guns should be using the M833, not M774. But as I said earlier, Gaijin will literally do anything rather than give America a good vehicle. This lack of a high-powered Sable means compared to literally every other vehicle at 10.7, you are just unable to snap shots. You are going to have to aim more carefully, slowing down the pace of play in the Abrams. Despite its reputation for being one of the fastest MBTs in the game, I'd seriously recommend playing the M1 Abrams in a static position, allowing enemies to come to you. Use your speed to get into a strong position at the start of a game, and then basically just camp. If an enemy gets to a cap before you, pick a defensive position, let them cap, and then basically ambush them when they leave the area. Rushing in there is almost certainly going to get you killed. If you do choose to play in a static position, then the Abrams does become a bit of a monster, especially the later variants of the M1, which get substantially better cannons, ammunition, and optics. Overall, the anemic firepower, bypassable armour, and slightly above average mobility makes the M1 Abrams one of my least favourite tanks in the American tech tree. There is no reason whatsoever that it is placed at battle rating 10.7, especially when the T-80UD and the T-72AV terms are still both 10.3, both of which have better firepower and armour. The main issues with the M1 could easily be remedied by the addition of M833, which would give it around 20mm more penetration, or even giving the tank M900 and moving it to battle rating 11.0. Failing that, just put the Abrams down to battle rating 10.3, where it wouldn't see the harsh up tiers to battle rating 11.7. Because the M1 Abrams is 10.7, I never play this tank, I just stick to 10.3. You don't see a lot of up tiers, you have fantastic vehicles at 10.3. So the Abrams for me, it's just a skippable vehicle. There's no point ruining the 10.3 lineup by making it 10.7. I have no idea why you'd ever want to play this. So while you do have to grind the Abrams to progress down the Abrams tree, I wouldn't actually recommend playing it that much. And it certainly is not worth ruining the fantastic 10.3 American lineup. After the M1, we have the M1A1. Put simply, this was a slightly new turret design, allowing for the introduction of the M256 120mm cannon. This gives you substantially better firepower compared to the original M1. The M1A1 Abrams is basically using the turret that we looked at on the 120S, but instead of having the god-awful M60 chassis, we now have the enhanced mobility of an Abrams. This makes the early M1A1 one of the better Abrams variants in the game. Unlike the later variants of this tank, which are bogged down with additional add-on armour, the M1A1 is still a young buck with plenty of speed, but with a new powerful main gun. Starting with the mobility, it's basically the same as the previous M1, but with a slight reduction to the power to weight ratio, due to the increased weight of the new turret. The power to weight ratio is still 26.6 horsepower per ton, giving it a fantastic level of mobility. The armour of the M1A1 is also improved compared to the original M1 Abrams, but only by about 50mm of effective thickness. Whereas the M1 Abrams has around 360mm of NERA in the turret cheeks, the M1A1 has 800. This gives the M1A1's turret cheeks about 1000mm of effective thickness against chemical rounds, and about 480mm of effective thickness against SAKO. Like the mobility, this level of armour is useful, but just like the original Abrams, the armour cannot be relied upon due to the large turret ring weak spot. Just like the M1, brawling isn't really a great tactic in the A1, as closing the distance between you and an enemy just makes his job easier. So unless an enemy has fired a shot, and you know you can beat his reload, pushing out of cover is never a good idea. Trying to trade with an enemy in the M1A1 is only going to get your breach shot, or worse, get you sent back to the hangar with a hefty repair bill. Now seems like a good time to point out the internal armour schemes of all the Abrams variants. All of the ammunition is housed in blowout panels. You have a large cache of rounds carried in the turret bustle, which will blow outwards, and the remaining rounds carried by the Abrams are stored in the lower hull, and if hit, this ammunition will blow out downwards. This means a penetrating shot to the magazine alone will usually not result in a killed crew. This mainly protects you from side aspect shots. You will lose all of your ammunition, but at least you can retreat to a capture point and reload. Just be aware though, these blowout panels will not save you if an incoming round penetrates your turret armour and then also penetrates the ammunition. War Thunder will simulate the deflagrating powder entering the crew compartment and turning the E3s and E4s into nice crispy bacon. But moving on, the addition of the 120mm gun does pay off, as it now allows you to easily penetrate pretty much any MBT at your own battle rating, and still gives you usable levels of firepower in a full up tier. But of course with Gaijin, fun isn't allowed without some suffering first, and your stock shell is a heater fest round. But in the first rank of the modifications, we get the M829 Sabre round with about 470mm of penetration. Like with the 120S, in the fourth rank we then also unlock the M829A1, which significantly increases penetration and allows you to utilise the true power of the Abrams. With the M829A1 you have just under 600mm of penetration, allowing you to penetrate pretty much every vehicle you encounter, as long as you learn the key major weak spots of most vehicles. There are still some weaknesses however. You're still only using a first gen thermal imager, which really is a pain to use at 11.3. Nevertheless, it is still usable, but I'd recommend once you've found a target in the thermal optic, I'd switch back to the regular optical sight for actually firing. Despite the armour weaknesses, if you play the M1A1 the same way I recommended playing the M1, that being using your speed to occupy a strong position at the start of a match, and then being largely passive, the M1A1 again is an absolute powerhouse, made even better by the fantastic Sabre round. The M1A1 is one of the most enjoyable Abrams to play, as it retains the fantastic mobility of the early Abrams, but combines it with the major firepower advantages of the later ones. That being said, battle rating 11.3 is quite a weird battle rating at the moment. It sees quite a lot of up tiers. But all that being said, the M1A1 Abrams is a fantastic vehicle that is only really held back by the low res thermals. Folded with the M1A1 is the IP M1. This was a halfway model between the M1 and the M1A1. It uses the same turret as the M1A1, but used up the remaining 105mm cannons in the US inventory. This gives you essentially a backup M1A1 Abrams at the same battle rating 11.3, with the exception of a slight reduction in the firepower department. It is still a very good tank though, despite using the weaker gun, as it now gets access to the M900 round that we covered on the M1128 Striker, with just over 520mm of armour penetration. It's quite a lot less than the M829A1 with that 600mm of penetration, but for a backup vehicle, it is still exceptional in my opinion. Because it is essentially just a 105mm armed M1A1, I don't think I can really say much more about this vehicle. It plays and feels exactly the same as the A1, just use your speed to get to a strong early game position, and then just camp out under the stars, occasionally discharging your large rifled cannon. The last of the Abrams in rank 7 is the M1A1HC, which stands for Heavy Common. This was an armour upgrade, giving it depleted uranium implants, substantially improving the protection against incoming kinetic rounds. It also received a rather pointless addition in the form of the AN-VLQ-8A electro-optical dazzler system, which protects you from early forms of anti-tank guided missiles, which you will never face. The main change though is the armour, and just like the M1A1, you retain the 800mm of NERA elements in the turret, but gain the depleted uranium inserts as well, giving you very good protection against both kinetic and chemical rounds, with the thickest part of the turret providing around 750mm of protection against DM53, the best SABO currently in game, and around 1150mm of protection against a top tier heater vest round. Unfortunately though, due to the turret ring still existing, this armour upgrade is easily bypassed by just shooting the breach or the turret ring. Unless you are hull down or facing a new player that's just purchased an 11.7 premium, the upgraded armour isn't really something you can rely on in close range brawling combat, primarily because of these obvious gaping weak spots. The addition of the depleted uranium has also added around 4 tons of weight, bringing the Heavy Common up to 61.2 tons, dragging the power to weight ratio down to 24.8 horsepower per ton, making you noticeably more sluggish compared to the M1A1 as well as the IPM1. This is the start of what I call the Abrams bloat. Every Abrams from here on in just gets heavier and heavier, with absolutely no worthwhile improvements to armour or firepower, with the exception of 3 variants that get access to second generation thermals. While the armour is much better, the mobility much worse, the firepower is only slightly improved, gaining access to the M829A2 SABO, with just under 630mm of penetration against flat armour. Compared to M829A1, you gain about 30mm of extra penetration in both flat and angled armour profiles. This makes M829A2 one of the strongest rounds currently in War Thunder, only being beaten really by DM53 fired by the Leopard 2A7. This extra firepower and armour makes the Heavy Common even better in a hull down static position, but the huge loss in mobility does hurt your agility to get to those strong positions at the start of a game. Because the M1A1 Heavy Common is located in the Marine tank line, which is on the left hand side of the tech tree, I don't really feel like it is worth the grind in my opinion. You don't need this tank in order to get the main line of the American Abrams, so you don't even need the Heavy Common to research the rank 8 American MBTs. Because of this, I'd say it is optional whether you want to grind out this vehicle. It isn't particularly fun to play in my opinion, due to the massive drop in mobility, the increase in battle rating to 11.7, and while the M829A2 is nice, the faster M1A1 at 11.3 is more effective in game, and basically has all of the capabilities of the Heavy Common. So to recap the Abrams variants in rank 7, the original M1 is fitted with a 105mm cannon, the IPM1 received the more modern standard turret, but used old 105mm guns, the M1A1 received a new turret as well as a new 120mm gun, and the last vehicle we looked at, the M1A1 Heavy Common, was basically an M1A1 designed for the US Marine Corps, with the turret that what would become the M1A2, which we'll cover in the next rank, in rank 8. Basically, the M1A1 and the IPM1 are where the Abrams peak in my opinion. And finally for rank 7, let's look at a very schizophrenic vehicle, the HSTVL. This was a joint project by the US Army and the US Navy, aimed at trying to use high speed and small stature to completely bypass the usual requirements for thick armour. This was done on a small chassis, powered by a gas turbine engine, and also used a revolutionary new small caliber but high velocity cannon. While the HSTVL did have a lot of positives, Both the Army and Navy determined it was unsuitable for infantry support, the main purpose of all armoured vehicles. In War Thunder, the HSTVL sits at battle rating 11.7, pushing it out of the fun 11.3 lineup, meaning it is only really useful at top tier. The HSTVL has one of the highest levels of mobility in War Thunder, with a power to weight ratio of 32.5 horsepower per tonne, giving it fantastic flexibility on the battlefield. The high speed, combined with the very small stature of this vehicle, makes it incredibly sneaky, as well as hard to hit, especially if you have good map knowledge and know where you can hide the vehicle and set up ambushes. Like the Leopard 1, the HSTVL traded the concept of thick frontal armour, instead relying on its speed in order to avoid enemy guns. Because of this, the armour and survivability of the HSTVL is rather poor, only having 25mm of armour plate covering the whole vehicle. This makes the tank more vulnerable than a blonde secretary working for Harvey Weinstein, being incredibly vulnerable to artillery, high explosive rounds, casts, drones, as well as a particularly sharp stick. All of these things pose a huge threat for a HSTVL player, not to mention heavy machine guns or actual anti-tank cannons. But can the HSTVL dish out the damage? Well, that's kind of controversial. It uses a very high velocity 75mm cannon that is fed by a 1-second autoloader, giving you a blistering rate of fire. The main issue comes with your main ammunition, the XM885. You can only penetrate 276mm of ammo with this round, which means frontally most main battle tanks are pretty immune. Ironically, if you are going up against an enemy Abrams player, you can just simply shoot straight through the turret ring. Also, due to the small SAKO, the post-pen damage is very poor. It doesn't create anywhere near as much spalling as the large 120mm SAKO rounds, meaning several shots are typically going to be required to knock out an enemy MBT, even from the side. This anemic firepower is made even worse if an enemy is carrying explosive reactive armour or other types of applique armour on the side of the vehicle. Many Soviet MBTs carry hull-based pouches of armour, should we say, like the T-80 BVM, making it pretty impossible for you to damage, even in a side aspect. Contact 5 and Relict also pose a huge issue for this SAKO round, as it basically eats it up for breakfast, meaning many Soviet tanks can't even be killed from the side without expending quite a few rounds of ammunition. The HSTVL also comes equipped with a first generation thermal imager, which is helpful for acquiring targets, but again for actually shooting, I'd recommend switching back to regular optics. The tank also gets an infrared tracker, giving you a lead indicator against planes and enemy helicopters. While your SAKO round isn't really the best for engaging flying opponents, the XM884 proxy fused high explosive round is. Just be aware, in the HSTVL you can only carry 26 rounds of ammunition in total, so I'd recommend taking about 18 rounds of SAKO and filling the rest with high explosive, giving you a somewhat balanced loadout. Where the HSTVL really excels though, is dealing with enemy infantry fighting vehicles, giving it a very similar role in battle to the World War I battlecruiser, hunting down its smaller, less well-armed cousins with ruthless efficiency. Jackie Fisher would be proud. This leaves the HSTVL being a little weird in-game. It can't really take on enemy MBTs frontally, so on all of the newer maps in War Thunder, which are essentially just Call of Duty maps, where you have no real option other than going down 3 different tunnels, I'd recommend probably not even spawning the HSTVL into these maps. Save it for one of the more open rural maps where you have the width and breadth to go on a little adventure, hopefully fanning the sides of some juicy Soviet MBTs along the way. That covers all of our tech tree vehicles for rank 7, but we still have one last squadron vehicle to look at. This is the M1A1 AIM, an Australian variant of the American MBT. This tank has much more modern electronics and optics compared to the US variants. The AIM sits at battle rating 11.7, alongside the M1A1 Heavy Common, and the premium clickbait. This uses the M1A1 hull, but uses the depleted uranium armour of the later Abrams model. It also gets second generation thermal imagers, something that the US Abrams don't get until the M1A2 SEP. This gives you vastly better gun handling, as you can spot people so much easier. A slight downside of the AIM though is the ammunition. Unlike the M1A1 Heavy Common, the AIM does not receive the M829A2 round, instead using the KEW, which gives you significantly less penetration across the board. The M829A2 has 629mm of flat penetration, and 364mm of pen against armour angled at 60 degrees, whereas the KEW round can only penetrate 580mm of flat armour and 337mm of armour angled at 60 degrees. While this is definitely lower, I found that the KEW is still an actually incredibly good round. Despite the weaker main shell, I think that the AIM is the best Abrams variant currently at battle rating 11.7, purely down to the addition of the second generation thermals. This is basically for the reasons I've stated so many times now. Second gen thermals allow you to basically just sit in a good static position and spot people a lot easier. Like the other Abrams variants, I wouldn't recommend being aggressive in this tank, just setting up a nice little spot, cracking out some cold Fosters, and shooting shit with the kangaroos for a while. And that covers all of rank 7. There are certainly some fantastic lineups here, but most of the Abrams are straight up trash compared to the contemporary MBTs of other nations. This is sad for US mains, but in reality, America and NATO are based around air power and infantry support, with peer-on-peer tank conflict not really being a major perceived issue. Hence why most NATO countries have not really upgraded their tank fleet since the early 2000s. Nevertheless, the 10.3 American lineup is fantastic and is really fun to play, with the 120S being a personal favourite of mine. In the lineup I take along the 120S, M1128, Lavad, XM975, M3A3 Bradley, and if you're lucky enough to own them, the CCVL and the M60 AMBT. For close air support, the F111A is unrivaled, being able to carry up to 8 3,000-pound bombs into a battle, and then egress the battle speed at supersonic speed is pretty overpowered. You can also bring along one of the two 10.3 helicopters in the US tech tree, either the AH-6M or the OH-58D, both of which can carry 4 Hellfire missiles, with the latter, the OH-58D, having better optics and thermals. Honestly, I would just ignore the M1A1 Heavy Common and stick to battle rating 11.3 if you do want to go above 10.3. This lineup consists of the M1A1, IPM1, M1 Abrams, M1128, M3A3, AGS, as well as the Lavad and the XM975. For closer support you can bring along the UH-60 DAP Blackhawk, as well as your choice of American fast jet, although personally I still use the F111A, as it is still a beast, even at battle rating 11.3. We now come on to rank 8, the smallest rank by far, and if I'm being honest, one of the worst in the US tech tree. Pretty much all of these tanks are bloat tanks, only added by Gaijin to fill out the American tech tree, where they pretty much aren't even worth grinding in my opinion. To be honest with you lads, I wouldn't progress past 10.3 at the minute in the US tech tree. While 11.3 is good, 11.7 and 12.0 are pretty much insufferable. The tanks don't get any better protected, they are far slower, and they are still using the same gun and ammunition as found on the M1A1 Heavy Common, with the only noticeable difference being the addition of higher res thermal images, which are nice, but I don't think it justifies the increase to battle rating 12.0. But let's start with the M1A2. This uses the same turret as found on the M1A1 Heavy Common, including the depleted uranium inserts, giving you the same effective turret cheek protection. The main difference of the M1A2 is the addition of a commander's independent thermal viewer, giving both the gunner and commander access to first generation thermal images. All of this for an increased research cost of 400,000 research points, due to the location in rank 8. Just like the Heavy Common, the M1A2 fires the M829A2 round, with fantastic penetration values. For some reasons, which I assume is the US Marine Corps needing more internal space for marine stuff, the M1A2 can carry 2 additional rounds compared to the Heavy Common, carrying 42 internal rounds compared to the 40 of the HC. Overall, the M1A2 has the exact strengths and flaws as the M1A1 Heavy Common. It has strong, thick frontal armour with a very punchy gun, but it's ultimately let down by the huge frontal weak spots, which pretty much allows any mildly angered person armed with anything above a 105mm cannon to completely bypass your armour. While the M1A2 was essentially just a clone of the Heavy Common with a commander's thermal, the M1A2 SEP and SEP V2 at least add something interesting, but ultimately they are still not really worth the grind, and more importantly, they are not fun to play. Starting with the SEP, which currently sits at battle rating 12.0, and the reason it has a higher battle rating is the addition of a second generation thermal for the gunner and commander sights, significantly improving the target acquisition capabilities of the Abrams. This is great and significantly improves your ability to find targets on the large open maps. But we first got this feature down at battle rating 10.3 with the 120S, so why play the M1A2 SEP at 12.0? I genuinely have no idea. The SEP also adds an optional applique armor kit called Tusk, or Tank Urban Survival Kit. This was intended to provide additional protection to crew members, as many tanks were being ambushed by infantry at close range. People were coming out of alleyways, firing RPGs into the sides of tanks, and then running off. Now you may realise that we don't have infantry in War Thunder, so this upgrade is completely pointless, and it also adds 3.2 tons of additional weight to the vehicle. If you equip this armour, it will bring the power to weight ratio down to 24.4 horsepower per ton. This doesn't slow the tank down too much in terms of straight line speed, but when you try and turn in tight areas or go up a hill, you really start to notice all this extra weight piling on. The SEP and the SEP V2, as we'll see, don't really feel that athletic anymore, playing much more like a British Challenger 2. If for some reason you do choose to equip the Tusk pack, then the applique armour covers the entire side of the hull and provides you with a whopping 20mm of protection against sable rounds and 450mm of protection against chemical warheads. While this will prevent the penetration of most 120 and 125mm heat FS rounds, it isn't going to do anything against the large caliber anti-tank guided missiles fired by both the Chinese and the Soviet infantry fighting vehicles, hence the reason I don't carry it. It doesn't do anything against light tanks or helicopters, so it's basically just dead weight. Now there is some merit to the argument that this does give you additional armor protection against infantry fighting gun, 30mm cannon for example, nullifying some of the more powerful Soviet and Chinese IFVs such as the BMP-2M and the ZBD-04A. However, this can also be done with proper positioning and being aware of your surroundings. And also the high power tandem ATGMs carried by these light tanks can go straight through the front of your armour anyway. With the Tusk kit unequipped, the M1A2 SEP plays just like the M1A1 Heavy Common and M1A2, except with higher resolution thermal images. If you remember how I said to play the M1A1 and the M1 Heavy Common, basically using speed to get into a decent position, and then holding your ground, letting enemies come to you. Well, the M1A2 SEP also really excels in this role. It isn't a tank that you can be aggressive in though, at least if you value your turret ring and the lives of your crew members. But sitting on a hill with your second gen thermals, a 5-second reload, and nearly 630mm of penetration does allow you to pull off some wild games in the M1A2 SEP. But again, why not just play the M1A1 AIM at battle rating 11.7, or better yet, why not play the 120S at 10.3, where you have much better lineups and much more forgiving enemies. The final Abrams variant, and by far the worst, is the M1A2 SEP V2. This adds the most pointless shit you could ever imagine, and unlike the M1A2 SEP, you can't even choose to unequip it. The SEP V2 essentially added a bunch of things that made maintenance easier, improved internal wiring and sensors, as well as adding a remote control 50 cal to the roof of the vehicle, which does nothing other than give your position away, and make it easier for people firing high explosive rounds to overpressure your crew members. The new armor package is essentially the same as found on the SEP. It uses the same ERA package, but we now have an additional layer, providing 5mm of protection against sable rounds and 185mm of protection against chemical warheads. Combined, this gives you 25mm of additional protection against the main thing being fired at you at 12.0 and 635mm of protection against rounds that are never really fired at you at battle rating 12.0. While the Tusk kit may protect you against incoming 30mm auto fire, overall it's just dead weight that absolutely nukes the mobility of the Abrams. With the tank now weighing 67.5 tons, the power to weight ratio drops down to 22.5 horsepower per ton. This isn't as bad as the British Challenger 2s, but even the German Leopard 2A7 outclasses it in terms of mobility now. And the Leopard 2A7 outclasses the Abrams in terms of firepower, armour and mobility, so Why is it the same battle rating? In terms of firepower, the gun, ammunition and optics are all the same as found on the M1A2 set. So to put it all in perspective, as we unlock the more and more modern Abrams variants, the weight drastically increases, the mobility takes a nosedive, and your survivability doesn't see a noticeable increase. As I've said multiple times now about the other Abrams variants, the SEP V2 is still great in a static position, letting enemies come towards you. You still have great thermal optics, one of the best rounds in the game, as well as a 5-second reload when aced. The SEP V2 is still useful in a match, but it isn't even close to being one of the best MBTs currently in War Thunder. To summarise the whole Abrams tank line, they are generally fast, well armed, but massively vulnerable unless hull down. These weaknesses, combined with the generally poor map design at top tier, prevent the Abrams from really excelling. It wants to be out roaming open country and deserts, staying hull down, and eliminating entire divisions at range. The problems with the Abrams is that they are all early 2000 vehicles at best, fighting modern Soviet and NATO tanks, all of which at top tier have the same, if not better optics, ammunition, reload speeds, and armour protection, which negates all of the advantages that the Abrams had historically in conflicts such as the Gulf and Iraq wars. Finally, for rank 8, and for this entire video series, is the ADATS, or Air Defense Anti-Tank System, and unfortunately, it is another mixed vehicle, at least when compared to an actual competent air defense vehicle, such as the Pantsir in the Russian tech tree. The ADATS was going to be the US Army's premier short-range air defense system, but just before it went into serial production, the Cold War ended and the US Army cancelled all of its orders. The ADATS was going to be mounted on a modified M3 Bradley chassis, the same vehicle that we covered at battle rating 8.3. This gives the ADATS a fairly mobile hull, at least by anti-air vehicle standards, as it has a power-to-weight ratio of 20.3 horsepower per tonne. You can use this to get around the map at a decent speed, which I guess is useful in the latter part of a match. But due to the ADATS's huge size, you are easily spotted when out in the open, as well as behind cover, so I don't fancy your chances of getting behind enemy lines untouched. The reason I bring this up is the multi-purpose playstyle of the ADATS. As you probably guessed from the name, the vehicle is able to effectively engage both air and ground targets. This is due to the combination of a 25mm cannon, as well as the MIM-146, a missile with 900mm of penetration and a range of 10 km. In the anti-tank role, the missile has a standard chemical warhead, lacking a tandem charge. This kind of limits the ability of the MIM-146 to penetrate a lot of the high-tier Soviet and Chinese MBTs. But with the missiles travelling much slower than a sabot round, as well as the fact you can only fire these missiles once a vehicle has come to a stop, I try to avoid using the ADATS as a sort of tank destroyer if possible. Better options are available, such as the trusty M1128, or literally any of the Horde of Abrams variants. What I'm saying is, don't try to be aggressive in the ADATS. If you go looking for a fight, you're probably not going to win it. In the air defense role, the missiles in my opinion aren't much better. While it is very effective against slow-moving vehicles such as helicopters and drones, against maneuvering targets such as the horde of Soviet attacker and multi-role fighters recently added, looking at you SU-34, it really does struggle to counter them if they are being flown by a competent pilot who knows how to look after his energy. After around 5 kilometers, the missile rapidly starts to bleed energy and is easily defeated by maneuvering enemy fast jets. While the ADATS is superb at swatting Ka-52s out of the sky, it is nowhere near as effective as the Pantsir system, currently ruining the lives of all top-tier American CAS players. This is just another example of Gaijin giving America a mid-1980s vehicle, while the other nations are literally getting vehicles designed in the late 2010s. It's either Russian bias or Gaijin is literally admitting that Russia is 40 years behind NATO in military capabilities, and to be fair, it probably is both. The ADATS also comes equipped with the same 25mm cannon as found on the original M3 Bradley, with the same ammunition to boot. This means, unlike the M3A3, we do not get an AP FSDS belt, nor the second-gen thermal imagers, instead still relying on the fuzzy first-gen IR cameras, as well as the good old APDS belts. At battle rating 8.3, this cannon was fantastic. At 11.7, it really is past its prime, both in terms of dealing with enemy tanks and enemy aircraft. To start, at top tier, most enemy CAS jets and helicopters aren't really going to be inside cannon ranges, typically launching their missiles at very long range using fire and forget air-to-ground missiles, making your cannon pretty much useless, at least in the anti-air role. In the anti-tank role though, you still do have 81mm of penetration. It's not really good enough to get the job done frontally against anyone, but you can use it to defend yourself against enemy IFEs that do try to like to rush spawns. The real kick in the balls though with the ADATs, unlike the Bradley at battle rating 8.3 which had a stabilised cannon, the ADATs loses the stabiliser, so you've got a very anemic 25mm gun that's using terrible first gen optics, and also is unstabilised, making it pretty useless unless you are static, letting the enemies come to you. Like the Abrams, the ADATs is forced into a sort of static playstyle where it can't really do much without the support of a friendly MBT, even though the MIM-146 are laser guided and should easily be capable of launching on the move. Gaijin for some reason hasn't coded this into the game, so your primary anti-tank weapon require you to be stationary, at a battle rating where 60-ton tanks are streaming around the battlefield at high speed. This issue, combined with the small ammunition count of 8 missiles, really nukes the ADAT's ability to have a meaningful effect on the battlefield. While the ADATs is still somewhat useful in the anti-air role, I'd say it is a complete write-off if you're trying to use it as a sort of pseudo-tank destroyer. If you do want something for that, then I would recommend going back and using the M3A3 Bradley. But again, with rank 7 finished, I bring the conclusion of this rank to be basically, why on earth continue the grind past battle rating 10.3? I generally can't think of a reason other than you just really like the Abrams and want to have them on your lineup. There are no variants of the Abrams that can really be added now that would fix the major issues outlined in this video. As dumb as it sounds, I generally wouldn't even recommend grinding out rank 8 of the US tech tree. It isn't fun to play, they get worse the higher in battle rating you go somehow, and the one saving grace of top tier America, that being the exceptional cast jets, are now basically hard countered by the seemingly infinite amount of Panzer plays sitting in the enemy spawn. If you do choose to make a 12.0 lineup, the obvious choice of a first spawn is going to be the M1A2 SEP, without the add-on armour selected. This gives you a tank with a good hold down protection, fantastic firepower, and second gen thermals. You can then fill up your lineup with the Abrams of your choice, whether that be the Squadron M1A1 AIM, the Premium M1A1 Clickbait, or any of the other tech tree variants. It's also important to remember not to negate the lower tier vehicles, such as the HSTVL, Lavad, M3A3 Bradley, as well as the M11128. For closer support, the choice is yours. If you want to stick to the battle rating of 12.0, then the F-16A is probably your best choice, with 2 GBU-8s and 6 AGM-65B Mavericks. If you don't mind up tiering yourself to 12.7, which basically means you will never get a down tier to 11.0, then you can take out fantastic jets such as the F-16 Charlie and the F-15E, both of which have a plethora of air-to-ground weapons. To conclude this two-part video series, the American tech tree has a lot of ups and downs. It starts getting very strong at battle rating 2.7 with vehicles such as the M3 Lee, M5A1, M8A1, M3 Grant and the M16 MGMC. You also have a fantastic lineup between 3.3 and 4.0, with all of the early Shermans. One of the better lineups for the US at the minute is battle rating 5.3, where you have a nice mix of capabilities, as well as avoiding the 6.7 German Giga-Chad lineup, with standout vehicles such as the M36 Jackson, T1E1, M4A276, and the M4A176. A full battle rating increase brings us back to 6.3, where again, America has a great fun lineup, well suited for laid back players who can take a bit of bullshit. Constantly facing King Tigers and Jagdtigers is certainly stressful, but with vehicles such as the M109A1, M41A1, and the T25, you can still have a really good time at this battle rating. Moving on to probably the battle rating that America completely dominates, and that is 7.0. You'll have a fantastic selection of light tanks such as the M56, T92, and the M55176 if you're lucky enough to own it. In terms of mediums, the M46 and the premium M46 Tiger are more than capable of taking on anything you come across with their fantastic 90mm heater fest round. But the lineup really is made by the fantastic premium T29 heavy tank that gets put on sale several times a year, and is undoubtedly the best starter premium for the US tech tree, as it prints both Silver Lions and Nukes. Battle rating 8.3 is also a fantastic lineup, but you do have significant competition here. Vehicles such as the M3 Bradley, XM800T, M551 Sheridan, and the M60A2 Starship are all personal highlights of the US tech tree. You also have an emerging battle rating 9.3 meta, with vehicles such as the MBT70, XM803, the premium XM1, as well as the M60A3 TTS and M247 Sergeant York. We then come to the second best US lineup in the game, and that of course is the 10.31. I really can't get over how good the 120S is, especially when you play it patiently and really put its gun and fire control systems to work. It's also backed up by the M1128, M3A3, Lavad, XM975, CCVL, M60A and BT, as well as fantastic cast vehicles such as the F111A. Top tier is viable for the Americans, but you are actively putting yourself at a disadvantage playing it, with only really Britain and Israel, which have worse top tier lineups in my opinion. And that is a wrap, lad. Thank you very much for watching this series. I'm going to be releasing a video going over all of the premiums in the US tech tree, which should come out in a couple of days or a week later or something, so keep an eye out for that. As always, this video would not be possible without the support of my YouTube members, so I'd like to say a big thank you to Lola Alphonse, Tans, Debo LX, Dr. Bob, Tomster013, Shlunty, Van Halen, Diogenes, and Econ. Once again lads, big thank you for watching this video, and if you made it all the way to the end, leave a comment saying I hate Panseers.